We are now going to begin looking at how to set up our code into modules using the traditional module pattern. For many years, there was not a structure for creating modules in JavaScript. In order to address that, developers came up with a pattern, the module pattern, that would allow them to do exactly this. Later, libraries like CommonJS added ways to do this without this pattern. And then, eventually, ES6 provided a native way to accomplish this. So why would we want to talk about the traditional module pattern? Well, 3 reasons for that. First off, you will run into this pattern if you work on any existing code. It's out there, so you're going to run into it. Second, this pattern is great for showing the application of JavaScript features and concepts. So simply learning and using the pattern will cement those in your mind. And these are some very important concepts. And finally, for small projects, you may want to use this pattern to structure your code. Now, the development of the module pattern drew on JavaScript features such as function scope, closure, ifs, and the ability to pass objects around. So these concepts that we have already covered will be applied in this pattern. Now, there are numerous variations on this pattern, but once you have learned one method, you can easily decipher the others. We will be looking at what is sometimes called the revealing module pattern. Now, the way I want to introduce this pattern is to first set up a module for our entire code. Later, we will break it out into separate modules. So let's jump to Visual Studio Code and get started. So here's our code. Now first, I'd like to talk about the advantage of having our code in a single function. In the traditional module pattern, we use a function to set up our module. And so that is the first step of creating a module, is to put the code inside of a single function. Notice we put it all in the init function, and then remember we invoke that function once the DOM content is loaded. So having it all in one function means first that there's only one variable that's on the global space, and that's the init variable. That's the one that contains the function. Another advantage is that everything inside of this function is currently private, meaning code outside of this function cannot access it. It cannot get to any of these methods, cannot get to any of the variables. None of those are available outside of the function, and so it makes them private. That's something that functions do for us. Now, is it possible that we could eliminate everything from the global space? Could we set this up so that even the init variable is not a part of the global scope? In this case, the window. Well, yeah, we've learned how to do that. We could do that with an IFI. So if we were to remove that and place a paren around it, we put the paren because otherwise we will get a syntax error. It will think we're defining a function declaration, and when there's no name after it, it'll give us a syntax error. So by putting parentheses around it, it turns it into an expression, and thereby we don't get that error. So we can come down to the end of this, put another paren, and then we can put a set of parentheses to cause it to be invoked. Now with that being invoked, we don't need this anymore. It will automatically invoke it for us. Now really quick, let's just look at that before we talk about this a little bit more. So if I save that, and I'm running it in a live server here, as we can see down there with the port information. So I'm going to pull this up. ES6 presented us with, and it's still working for us. Now, what about this whole DOM content loaded that we just removed? What if that were important? Well, technically, it's not. If we take a look at our HTML page, notice where we place the script tag. It's at the bottom of the body. And so everything loads before we try to act on it. But what if it were important? What if we did want to do DOM content loaded before we did anything inside of here? Well, inside of this function, this iffy, we could set up an init function. We could just set up an init function that had these declarations, that had the event listeners attached to it, and then that called load JSON. All of those things that depend on the DOM being loaded. Those could be inside that init function. And then down here at the bottom, we could attach an event listener to document for DOM content loaded, just like we had before. So simply because we've hidden things inside of a function, which we've done here, we've made them private, it doesn't mean we can't access things outside of the function. We can still access things on a global scope. And the document is part of those things that we can access. And so we could still set that up if we chose to. Now, I'm fine with just having it here at the end of the body tag and having it load at that time. That works great for me. So I'm going to stick with that. So we have our basic structure of a module here. Basically, this is self-contained code. It's not going to bump into other things since it's in a single JavaScript file. That makes it more manageable and reusable. Now we can make it more manageable and reusable, which we'll be doing by breaking things out into more files. But we have all of the elements of a module here. However, we're missing something that's important. Remember, we talked about that modules are able to make available functions outside itself so that other parts of our code can draw on that module. Right now, this is simply a private piece of code. There's no way we can use any of the functions in here for anything else because there's no way to access them. We can't get to, say, the getRandomInt function if we wanted to use it. And that would be a great function to use in other places. But we can't get to it because it's private inside of this function. So how do we make these things public? How do we broadcast them outside of this iffy? Well, the first step is decide which things we want to make public. And then what we do, and this is very common with the revealing module pattern, is we come down here at the bottom. I'm just going to put a comment that this is public. So these are the things that we make public. And then what we're going to do is return an object. And inside of that object, we're going to place every method, and it could be properties if we wanted to use some of the variables that we want to make public. We'll put those in that object. And we're going to return that object to something outside of this function, to a variable outside this function. Now we'll talk about that part in just a minute, but let's look at how we would set up those things we want to be public. So down here we have just an empty object that we're returning. That's all we have so far. Let's add something to that. Let's add a method. So let's come up to some of these utility functions because these are the types of things we may want to make accessible outside. Let's say we wanted to add this format minutes seconds function. Let's say we wanted to make that public. So I'm going to come down here and on the public version I can call that whatever I want. But let's say I want to keep the name of the method the same, format minutes and seconds. And then I simply point that to format minutes and seconds. So there is our first method that we're going to make public. So see how this works? We're returning an object, and anything we place on that object will be available. So in this case, format minutes and seconds. That will be a method that's available on the object. Anything else we add to this object will be available. We simply point it to something inside of our module, and thereby they have access to whatever it is we point to inside of our module. Now we can make another one. Get random init is one we would want to. And I'm going to have the public method for that be the same as get random init. Now, if you remember with concise properties, this is really all we need to enter in order to do the same thing as what we did up here. That's enough. Concise properties that were made available allows us to define the method that way. Now for this one that's still up here, let's say I wanted to change the name of this to format time. So now format time is going to be the public name. This will be the private inside of here. And whenever I refer to that, to format time, it's going to call this method. All right, let's add one more. Let's just say get last part of URL. And there's our third one that we're going to add. Once again, we're going to use a concise property in order to do that. So now this is what we're returning. Now we need to set this to something. We need to create a variable up here that is going to accept that. So I'm going to call it main module. I'm going to set that equal to the results that are returned, which is this. So main module is now going to be an object that has 3 methods on it. Let's save this and just take a look at it. So right now our code is still working fine.
ES6%.
Didn't affect that at all. But now if we wanted, we're getting an error about fave icon not loading. But if we wanted to access those methods for something else, we could simply do main module dot, and now we have format time, get last part of URL, get random init. So if I did get random int and I pass in a 0, 9, I get a result back. So now those 3 are available outside of this IFI, this module that we created. This is the public portion. And notice the advantage of this. Any of these methods that we've made public still have access to anything that's inside of the function through closure. So that's a very powerful thing. We can make private properties inside here that only these methods have access to. And then we provide only those methods that we want to provide publicly down here. And so it protects our module. It makes it so we can move that code around. If somebody plugs this into their own code and they create a variable stop btn, it doesn't affect what we have inside of here. It's not going to bother that. If they try to make a change to something, they're not able to. They can't change this video list. They only have access to what we provide publicly down here. And that is all. Now, one final issue. With creating this variable up here, we've just added something to the global scope again. We put something on that global space. Well, what do we do about that? Well, we can make it a little bit safer if we want. We can check to see if this already exists. And if this already exists, we'll just add what we're providing to it. Otherwise, we'll have an empty object. So let me show you how we do that. So main module, and we're going to set that equal to main module or an empty object like that. Now let's take a look at this code and make sure we can understand it. This is using some concise operators. Basically what happens is if main module exists, it's going to return that to main module. If it doesn't exist, it's going to return an empty object. And so that sets things up for our main module without overriding something if it's already called main module. However, down here, even if we move this let declaration, whatever is returned is going to be placed in main module and will overwrite whatever's already here. So how would we get around that? How would we solve this if we wanted to? If we were worried about collisions and we wanted to make sure we weren't interrupting anything? Well, this is the way we'd do it. We could simply take this portion of our statement and come down here, and then inside the parentheses, pass that in. So if main module exists, we're passing in main module. If not, we're passing in an empty object. Then we could simply grab that. Let's call it main. We would remove this part here. And then down where we wanted to make things public, we would simply attach them to main. And so we could do that a couple of different ways. We could do something like this, where we do main dot, and then the name we wanted for the function, get element by ID, and we could set that equal to get element by ID, and then we return main. Or another way to do it, we could use a spread operator to spread that out, and then just add these things at the end. So if we save that, you can see we're getting an error, uncaught reference error, cannot access main module before initialization. Well, if we come back to the reason that it's happening is because we have a let here. If we change that to a var, now we don't get that error. It corrects the problem. The reason for that is because of a unique difference between var and let. Var declarations are hoisted, while let is not. So when we use let and the main module doesn't already exist, the JavaScript engine produces an error saying that the main module doesn't exist. With var, if the main module doesn't already exist, its declaration is hoisted, and a value of undefined is placed there. So the JavaScript engine knows that it exists when it does the OR evaluation down here. So that is how we can deal with placing something on the global space without creating conflicts. And this is the method I prefer, because passing something into the module, like we do here, is the technique we're going to be using as we break this apart more, and then allow modules to communicate with each other, or allow modules to use code from other modules. So let's move on to the next topic and begin working on that.